I came home from a 2-day trip and found myself locked out of my own land. Not metaphorically, not in some paperwork loophole kind of way. I mean physically locked out. Steel gate, heavy chain, fresh paint still stinking in the Texas heat, and a sign hanging dead center like a joke with a straight face. Private community property. No trespassing. I stood there with my keys in my hand, thinking maybe I'd taken a wrong turn, except I hadn't. 42 acres of dirt I'd bled for, sweated for, paid off in cash after 23 years pulling people out of burning buildings, and somehow I was the trespasser. I rattled that gate hard, metal clanging through the quiet, and for a second I just stared at it, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. See, none of this happened overnight. My name's Wade Callahan. I'm 45, retired firefighter out of Austin. 3 years ago, a busted knee finally convinced me I wasn't bulletproof anymore, so I took my savings and bought a stretch of land just outside a town called Briar Ridge. Nothing fancy, just a ranch house, a barn, a couple horses, peach trees I planted myself. And more quiet than I'd ever known in my life. That quiet was the whole point. Mornings on the porch with coffee going lukewarm in my hand, my dog Scout stretched across my boots, wind moving through the grass like a slow ocean. No sirens. No radios crackling. Just birds and the sound of my own breathing. For the first year it was perfect. Then the developers showed up. They bought the land along my eastern boundary, hundreds of acres, and within months it turned into one of those master plan neighborhoods with stone entry signs and decorative trees lined up like soldiers. Cedar Hollow Estates. And of course it came with an HOA. Now my land was older, clean deed, no HOA, no covenants. I made damn sure of that before I signed anything. But apparently that didn't matter to the folks running Cedar Hollow. The letters started first. Thin envelopes with fancy letterheads. Your barn color is inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. Please remove agricultural equipment from visible sight lines. Your fencing detracts from community presentation. I laughed the first couple times, tossed them straight in the trash. Figured once they realized I wasn't part of their little kingdom, they'd move on. They didn't. One afternoon a man in pressed khakis and a pale blue polo showed up at my gate. Clean haircut, shiny loafers that had never met mud. Introduced himself as Martin Huxley, HOA president. Smiled the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. Said they were just trying to protect property values. Said my ranch clashed with the community's refined image. I looked past him at rows of identical beige houses and said, "You built next to a ranch. What exactly were you expecting to see?" His jaw tightened. That was the moment I knew this wasn't about paint colors. It was about control. A few weeks later I started seeing survey flags along my eastern line, little orange markers popping up like warning lights. Everything still matched my paperwork, but something felt off. So I stopped by the county clerk's office. Old building, creaky floors, the kind of place where everyone knows your truck before they know your name. Harold, been there forever, pulled up recent filings and frowned. Turns out Cedar Hollow had bought a narrow strip that used to belong to the original ranch owner. Real skinny piece ran right up to my access road. I felt that cold knot settle in my stomach. 2 weeks later I drove to Houston to see my mom after a minor surgery. Stayed a couple nights, watched old westerns, ate greasy takeout, talked about my dad like we always do. I left early Sunday wanting to be home before dark, and that's when I found the gate. Tall steel fencing wrapping along their side of the boundary, curving, tightening, and sitting square on that skinny strip. They hadn't stepped on my land. They just wrapped theirs around it like a noose. Standing there in the dust, I didn't feel fear. Not even anger, not yet. Just something quiet and calculating. See, fighting fires teaches you something. Panic doesn't save houses. Planning does. They expected a blow-up. A shouting match. Lawyers on day one. Instead, I got back in my truck and drove into town. Called a friend, Luis Moreno, real estate guy, sharp as they come, owed me a favor from years back. Told him I needed to know who owned that strip before Cedar Hollow bought it. 2 days later he called me laughing. Said the guy who sold it still owned another tiny sliver, behind it one that connected to the county road. I didn't even let him finish. Told him to draw up the paperwork. 3 days later, that sliver was mine. And here's the kicker, the little utility shed behind their fancy new gate? The one holding maintenance tools, and the only physical key to that lock. Yeah, it sat squarely on my newly purchased land. I didn't say a word to them. Not yet, because sometimes the best move isn't loud. It's patient. I waited for the right moment. Cedar Hollow loved their events, ribbon cuttings, wine tastings, curated happiness. So when I heard they were hosting their big spring social, I figured that was my stage. That morning I pulled on clean jeans, boots older than half their houses, and drove down to the edge of my new strip. Balloons everywhere, banners talking about community. Golf carts buzzing like beetles. I parked my old F-250 where my property line cut across their access road and started hammering a wooden sign into the dirt. Private property. No trespassing. Owner, Wade Callahan. Didn't take 30 seconds before Martin came marching over, face red, smile gone. Asked what I thought I was doing. I just handed him the deed. Watched his eyes flick across the paper, and that was the moment something cracked. Not confusion. Fear. Because he knew what it meant. Without my strip, their gate was just an expensive decoration. I walked to the shed, unlocked it, pulled out the brass key labeled main gate, held it up between my fingers. Then I unlocked the gate from my side and drove through onto my land like I was coming home from war. Thought maybe that would be the end of it. I underestimated how far pride goes when money's tied to it. They came back with lawyers, threats, zoning petitions trying to reclassify my land as internal green space. Tried to legislate me out of my own property. That's when I called my cousin Caleb, land use attorney, calm as winter. He didn't raise his voice once. Just quoted statutes until their lawyer's confidence started leaking out through her shoes. But then things turned uglier. Bulldozers at night carving trenches near my fence. Someone shot my drone out of the sky when I tried to record it. A week later, masked men slipped into my barn with a gas can and a lighter. They ran when sirens screamed down the road, but that was the moment everything changed. This wasn't neighborly tension anymore. This was war dressed up in polo shirts. Sheriff Briggs, old friend from the firehouse days, watched the footage with a face like carved stone. Said they were trying to scare me into selling. And that's when something clicked in my head. If they were willing to lie, intimidate, maybe even burn, then this wasn't about aesthetics. It was about leverage. And leverage usually sits on something valuable. So I went looking. Tracked down the original rancher who sold them the land, Earl Whitaker, 80 years old, sharp as barbed wire. We sat on his porch drinking sweet tea, and I asked him if he'd sold them everything. He just smiled slow and said, "Developers see big parcels, they miss the seams." Turns out he'd kept a few odd slivers over the years. One of them ran right under Cedar Hollow's clubhouse. I felt the shift right then. Not revenge. Balance. 2 days later, I owned that sliver. Didn't make a scene. Didn't block doors. I just waited. The morning before our court hearing, I walked up to their glass front clubhouse at sunrise, nailed a notice to the door declaring they were operating on my property, tipped my hat to the security camera, and left. By lunchtime, the local news had it live on air. By dinner, the internet had done what it always does, turned polished into panic. Court the next morning felt less like a hearing and more like a slow collapse. Caleb laid everything out, the enclosure, forged permits, fake liens, attempted arson. Then he dropped the final blow, internal communications from the HOA board talking about manufacturing pressure to force me to sell cheap. You could hear the oxygen leave the room. The judge didn't yell. Didn't need to. Just ruled. Every motion against me dismissed. Liens voided. Reclassification denied. Then she referred the whole mess to the district attorney for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted arson. 2 hours later, deputies walked Martin and 2 board members out of their own glass office in handcuffs while residents watched from sidewalks, whispering behind manicured hedges. You'd think that would feel like victory. Honestly, it felt like quiet. The kind you get after a storm finally blows itself empty. I could have sold the land back to them after that. Plenty of folks told me to cash out, move somewhere quieter. But the fight was never really about money. It was about space. About who gets to decide what belongs somewhere. So instead of selling, I built something. Not a wall. Not another gate. An open-air pavilion. Wooden posts, metal roof, room for a few hundred folding chairs. Weekend rodeos, live country bands, youth barrel racing, veterans cookouts. Nothing polished. Just real. First event we held, I saw curtains twitching in those beige houses. Curiosity always wins eventually. Kids laughing. Horses snorting. Burgers burning, and nobody caring. A month later I got a letter from Cedar Hollow's new interim president. Young woman, sounded tired even on paper. She apologized for what the old board had done. Asked if maybe there was room to rebuild some kind of neighborly peace. I read it twice, set it on the counter, poured myself coffee, and stared out at the pasture. Here's the truth I didn't understand at the beginning. Most fights don't start because people are evil. They start because people are afraid. Afraid of losing control. Afraid of things that don't fit the picture in their head. And once fear mixes with money, it grows teeth. I wasn't perfect either. I could have laughed off those early letters with more grace. Could have cooled things before they boiled. But once lines get crossed, real lines, property lines, moral lines, they're hard to redraw. These days, Cedar Hollow still stands. So does my pavilion. On summer nights, you can hear applause drifting over the fence and sprinklers humming on their side. Sometimes folks wander over, at first quietly, then not so quietly. Turns out most people don't actually hate dust or noise. They just follow whoever sounds the most certain. And that's the part one still wrestle with. Was I right to push back as hard as I did? To escalate, expose them, make it public, to remind them every weekend that they don't control everything? Or should I have taken the high road sooner, sold the strip back, chosen peace over principle? Because here's what I learned through all of it: justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like standing still when someone tries to push you off your own ground. Sometimes karma doesn't come crashing in like thunder, it just waits, patient, until the truth has nowhere left to hide. So I'll ask you this. Where's the line between protecting your home and becoming part of the fight? If someone tried to box you in, legally, socially, quietly, would you hold your ground or walk away for the sake of peace? I'm curious what you'd do. Tell me, because stories like this don't really end when the gates come down. They echo in the choices we make next. And if you've ever felt pushed, cornered, underestimated, maybe this one was meant for you.